Scott Schaefer's pretty good, right? No, thank you, Scott, and thanks to our friends at KQED for making that happen, and to the secretary for coming out here. We're a little far away from his office. I appreciate him being here. This has been a great afternoon, and we're going to keep it going. I have the pleasure now of introducing another CalMatters journalist. Alejandro Lazo was a reporter at the Los Angeles Times and then at the Wall Street Journal, and came to CalMatters because he wants to cover his native California. He has deep roots up and down the state, rural, urban, all across California, and really wanted to be part of covering this state, and we're really honored to have him on our staff. And Alejandro is going to come up and bring his panel and get things started. Alejandro.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks very much. Thank you, Neil, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks, everybody, for joining our climate discussion. This is our, as you all know, our inaugural Ideas Fest. And it's really fantastic to see so much enthusiasm for our journalism and all of the important topics that CalMatters is tackling. California, as Neil mentioned, has been my professional home for about 2 years. After about a couple of decades as a professional journalist elsewhere, and it means so much to me to see all of the support for our work, especially in this moment journalism is certainly challenged, to say the least, and it really means so much to me. So thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for showing support for CalMatters, and I'm very happy to introduce our two guests to dive into our climate discussion. So California is my home, and as many of you know, California has the worst air pollution in the country. And this is especially true in the Central Valley, where I'm from and where I've been doing a lot of reporting on climate policy for CalMatters. Earlier this year, the Biden administration, based on the latest science, made it even more difficult for the agricultural communities in the valley to comply with a very important part of the Clean Air Act. So while I was working on that story, I spoke with our first guest here, Catherine Garoupa White, who is the executive director of the Central Valley Air Coalition. That was the first time I spoke to her, and I asked her what brought her to her work. And Dr. Catherine, that's how she likes to go, right? Dr. Catherine explained that while she's originally from Madeira, which is the geographic heart of the Central Valley, her interest in air pollution started 2 decades ago during a fellowship in India. Just seeing sort of the parallels between India and their experience with air pollution and what she saw happening in the valley with people breathing dangerous air, high rates of asthma, and so on. And I knew Dr. Catherine was someone I wanted to keep talking to, not just for that particular story, but continuously on this beat. And so, of course, she was one of the first people I thought to invite to discuss climate leadership in California and the subject of equality and where we're headed with all that. So thank you, Dr. Catherine, for joining us on stage today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our second guest is Dr. Manuel Pastor. He leads the Equity Research Institute at the University of Southern California. Dr. Pastor has authored 5 books. I got that right? 5 books on, no, more? Okay, well, he's written more than 5 books on subjects that include inequality, urban issues, social justice, environmental issues, solving these issues with practical solutions, community empowerment, and all of his work, or at least the majority, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, is centered here in California. He has a forthcoming book on the Imperial Valley, a part of California that's increasingly becoming known as Lithium Valley due to the lithium deposits in the Salton Sea, and so that area's potential future role as a domestic source of batteries for electric cars. So we'll delve into that topic today, but for now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Pastor. Thank you for joining us here today. It's a great honor, thank you. And so, let's just dive right in. As everyone can appreciate, the climate beat is a big global beat, and it can be really enormous, and it's sometimes pretty amorphous. But in California, it's a great place to be a reporter on this subject because you have not only a proving ground for climate policy, but the state has this decades-old reputation as being a leader on climate change and the environment in general. So I'd like to start there, and this question is for either of you and for both of you. Either of you would like to take it first, but what does it mean to be an environmental leader, a leader on climate change here? Just in general, what does leadership mean in this space?
Oh, I get to start? All right, thank you, Dr. Pastor. So good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Catherine here. Working on air pollution issues in the San Joaquin Valley has also introduced me naturally into the space of climate conversation. When I started working at CVAC in 2006, that was the year that AB 32 got passed, and so what we really saw was a lot of conversation around air pollution issues rapidly shifted towards climate justice. And as important and as necessary as that conversation is, in many ways it has bifurcated artificially the opportunity for us to meet our clean air and our climate goals and ensure that it is equity-centered, which is a key part of the title for today's panel, right? Not just that we're going to be able to prove that we can reduce emissions in California, but that we're going to do it in a way that fundamentally changes the distribution of benefits and burdens so that already heavily impacted environmental justice communities don't see pollution levels go up. But as you mentioned in the overview, Alejandro, the San Joaquin Valley hasn't yet met the 1997 standard for fine particles or the 1979 standard for ozone pollution. And these standards are so old that they can no longer be considered health protective. So while on the global stage, California leaders champion us as an environmental leader, I ask, how do we still have the most polluted air basin in the San Joaquin Valley and in the South Coast? Meeting our clean air goals and our climate goals should not be contradictory or come at the cost of one or the other. We should be doing both at the same time. And the San Joaquin Valley as a historical sacrifice zone that's very extractive but also has huge potential for renewables really is ground zero for making sure that we're innovating truly just solutions. And we're not there yet, but there's a lot that we can do.
Great. Dr. Pastor.
So I'll just start by saying it's $16, so several of which have been made into major motion pictures. So in which I was portrayed by, or I wanted to be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. Turned out to be George Lopez, but still it was a movie. So I'll tackle that topic in a minute. I always like to let audiences know if while I'm speaking my voice gets scratchier, tires out. It's not because of the hot air in Sacramento, which is actually mostly across the street. But I have a voice condition that's called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box that cause your voice to tire out or break. It is, by the way, the condition that Robert Kennedy Jr. has. When you listen to him, his voice is very scratchy. If my voice was not treated, I would sound like him. I would not be as delusional as he is. But I would sound like him. So let me say that I think it's important to start with understanding that the title of this about how can we lead on equity. Again, it's important to realize we led on inequity. This is a state that perfected redlining, particularly in my hometown of Los Angeles. It's a state that passed the first Asian exclusion laws that decimated the indigenous population from 150,000 to about 30,000 over the course of a short period of time, that exploited Mexicans, and as we'll hear on the next panel, systematically stripped assets from Black Californians, partly through the small amount of slavery, but mostly through redlining, underinvestment in education, etc. So California has basically been racism Lollapalooza. It's affected every ethnic group. And when I first started working on environmental justice research, one of the really interesting things was that nationwide, there was still a bit of a dispute about whether or not communities of color were disproportionately impacted. But after about the first 5 to 8 years of our work, in the rest of the nation, people are saying, well, we're still disputing it for the nation, but man, that's true in California.
Right.
And what's true in California, one important thing that people need to realize, and I won't say this in too fancy a way, the unfancy way is that race is more important than income. That is, if you look at the disparities in terms of exposure, proximity, et cetera, statistically, the effect of race is more significant and steeper than the effect of income. So it's easy to think that this is a set of problems that are occurring in poor communities, and they do occur in poor communities. But a black household making $100,000 a year is about 3 times more likely than a white household making $25,000 a year to be near a toxic release. So race has been part and parcel of this. So I think it's really important to realize that the recent leadership we've shown on climate comes from a state that seems to have been dedicated to destroying the climate. And the recent leadership we're showing on bringing the idea of racial equity into climate policy is because we did so badly in the past. And it created such a vibrant environmental justice movement in the state that they've ensured that it becomes part of climate policy moving forward.
Absolutely, and environmental justice is something that I've been really interested in and bringing onto the beat. I'd love to hear, just so that we have it defined for the audience, how do you define environmental justice? How do the two of you define environmental justice, just so we know what we're talking about, and then maybe we can talk a bit about, California's leadership or lack of leadership there in that space.
Sure. So when I think of environmental justice, I think both in terms of the process and the outcomes, or what is sometimes referred to as procedural justice and distributional justice. So procedural justice is about the opportunity for the most impacted communities and the most marginalized voices to be front and center when it comes to decision-making processes. That's absolutely historically not what we've seen, and definitely something that we're still working on. So that would be the procedural justice component. And then the distributional piece I alluded to earlier, where are the benefits in our communities? Where's the green space? Where are the schools that are really high performing? The community services, the libraries, versus what we would call the burdens, right? The toxic waste dumps, the refineries, the power plants, where are those burdens or environmental hazards concentrated? And as Dr. Pastor was talking about, there's ample literature from the United States, globally, California, you name it, showing that low-income communities and communities of color really are disproportionately receiving those burdens and not the benefits. And that's fundamentally the shift that we're trying to make if we want to achieve equity.
That's a great definition. The thing that I would add to it that we've been thinking about recently is to try to think about equity with a time dimension, to think about the past, the present, and the future. So in terms of thinking about the past, understanding the harms that have been caused, the fact that the asthma rate for children in Imperial Valley is 5 times the asthma rate in the rest of the state. That's a harm that's been caused by the neglect of the Salton Sea, what's called the playa or sand that's been kicked up, and the asthma rates that occur. And you can go through those over and over again in terms of exposure of children and the impact on academic performance, the past. When I think about the present, I think the present is about full participation in decision making. So our community is fully engaged and helping to set the policies that we're determining today. And then the future is trying to make sure that stuff that we're doing today doesn't, you could say inadvertently, but if it happens, stuff we're doing today, that we make sure it doesn't actually make things worse for people in the future. Just to give you an example, suppose you make a neighborhood, clean it up, green it up, it's become much more desirable. It's then ripe for gentrification and displacement. So how do you create community land trusts so that the land is held by the community? How do you build in affordable housing? How do you create opportunities for home ownership? Or in the Salton Sea region where there is so much lithium, how do you make sure that the good jobs that are created actually go to people who have lived there and suffered there when lithium wasn't attracting attention? So how do you think through the jobs of the future and who's going to get them? So adding to the environmental justice definition, a very good one that Catherine laid out, past, present, and future.
Absolutely. And Catherine and I spoke a bit about your work and your experience in the Central Valley. You just tell me, a bit about how your experience there has shaped your advocacy, your work, and your perspective on, California's leadership on this issue of climate. I mean, I think just for our audience, a few of the things that we hear a bit about, about California's role on the global stage. California put its commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions very early into law. As you mentioned, they passed the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006 that was under a Republican administration. The state has very strong tailpipe emissions standards on cars. Many other states have followed those standards. I remember being a reporter at the Wall Street Journal in 2020 when Governor Newsom signed the executive order transitioning us from gas-powered cars to zero-emission vehicles, and so on and so forth. This is the record that California projects, and it is a very much a real record. But I have also always been interested in speaking to you because you're from where I'm from, and we have this mutual understanding of this place, and I think it gives a good a perspective on this question of leadership.
Yeah, well, for me, I would say that this work has really been a combination of from the head and from the heart. As you've spoken to, Alejandro, I'm from the San Joaquin Valley. I grew up in Madera with asthma, with allergies, many family members that are impacted, but I was also relatively privileged. So I got a master's degree in social work from Fresno State and was very interested in community organizing and started working with the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition when they hired their first staff to organize in Madera County. So I had the really rich and challenging experience of learning about environmental justice directly from frontline community members, because when I would go out and say, hey, there's this state implementation plan so that hopefully we can meet clean air goals by 2025, surprise, we're here yet, and we're here now and we're asking for a longer extension, they were telling me things like, my father is still out working in the fields while they're spraying pesticides and they're not being provided with a mask, even though technically by law they're required to provide masks, but my father is elderly and he's undocumented and he's afraid about losing his job. So seeing the everyday impacts to people's basic quality of life and ability to survive in the San Joaquin Valley, which is an incredibly poor region that generates massive wealth. We're the most agriculturally productive region in the entire world today. We have really productive oil fields, but it's not the average person living in the valley that is benefiting from those practices. So while we've seen leadership in policy, we haven't always seen leadership in implementation and enforcement of those rules, especially when the oil lobby and the agricultural lobby are very powerful, and the San Joaquin Valley is a relatively rural region that has been both extracted from and used as a toxic waste dump or a place to leave the things that we don't. And so For me now, at the state stage, working on the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee at the Air Resources Board, a lot of what my focus has been is ensuring that climate programs like the Low Carbon Fuel Standard and Cap and Trade aren't doing things that are actually increasing the sources of pollution in our, not only in our region, but especially in our environmental justice neighborhoods, because our entire region has a problem, but just within the city of Fresno, within 5 miles, you can find a 20-year disparity in people's life expectancy based on those environmental hazards and social hazards that people are exposed to.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is just an incredible way of looking at this issue of the environment. You know, one of the things that I have gone and reported on over the last year has been this development or this attempt to develop carbon capture on the various fossil fuel plants. And California has quite a bit of has quite a few pilot projects underway. Many of them are in the Central Valley. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on right now, today with California policy. What's being pushed, what's being tried, and maybe we can start with the carbon capture issue, because I know we brought this up in our sort of conversation earlier last week.
Yeah, so I think this is another area where it's important to remind ourselves that our...
And maybe we should, maybe we should define what carbon capture is just for the audience.
Sure. Yeah.
You want to take a stab at it? Or,
Carbon capture, well, engineered carbon capture, use, and storage, or CCUS for short, is essentially a technology that is meant to attach to certain types of stationary sources to capture their carbon emissions and then do something with them, either turn them into a product or transport them somewhere and store them, usually by injecting it underground, which is part of why the San Joaquin Valley is a region where we have tens of thousands of oil wells already poked in the ground. So the suggestion is we have great geology to then go try to inject carbon underneath some of our most polluted communities in the San Joaquin Valley by attaching this type of equipment to old dirty infrastructure like biomass plants or some of the operations in the oil fields. So our real concern in the valley, and you're right, Alejandro, there's over a dozen projects going through the permitting process, and our concern is that we're continuing to extend the life cycle of fossil fuel infrastructure in some of our already most overburdened neighborhoods, when 85% of the way that we're supposed to meet our climate goals in California should be through direct reductions. And we're not there yet, and we need to focus on that 85%. And instead, there's a whole bunch of money from the federal government, from the state government, there's tax incentives to do this type of technology, carbon capture, and so there's what's been described as a real gold rush, especially from these large corporations like the oil industry, to try to tap into this money to basically say that they're going carbon neutral, right, or that they're cleaning up their emissions footprint, which not only is incredibly expensive, it's mostly only being relied on and tested in the United States and states like California. The cost of this technology will not go down over time the way that we can see with renewables, with wind or solar. So it's incredibly expensive. It's supposed to be very, 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 very narrowly applied to the most hard to decarbonize sectors, not refineries, not extending oil fields. Climate scientists will say we need it to reduce the legacy of carbon emissions in the air, but we shouldn't be using it to create credits or to extend dirty fossil fuel infrastructure, because that's actually just going to create more pollution in the long run. So exactly along the lines of what Dr. Pastor was saying about thinking in the future, is this actually going to have benefited these communities, or could it potentially increase our air pollution problems in the valley because it requires things like pipelines and truck trips, not to mention just the hazards from the carbon itself.
Absolutely, thank you. And I mean, again, to talk about current solutions, or what the fossil fuel industry or oil and gas industry and even the state are describing as solutions. California is saying that it must rely on these sorts of technologies to meet its greenhouse gas emissions, which the state is in danger of of not meeting. We recently reported on that here for CalMatters, how California could fail to meet its mandates for greenhouse gas emissions if it doesn't triple its rate of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so these ideas that perhaps were originally designed for the hardest, as you described, the hardest industries to decarbonize are now getting a good look by the oil and gas industry. And I just, kind of want to reflect on, what's that mean, and where are we headed, and what does it mean, to us if the state doesn't meet those targets?
So, a couple thoughts that are prompted by this conversation, and one is just beware of greenwashing. People telling you that something is green, when in fact you might capture the carbon, but you won't capture the particulates, and you will still have lots of problems. We should actually also be sure that our movement to electric vehicles is not a get out of pollution jail free card, so that we can continue to sprawl and not have compact cities, live far apart, etc. I love EVs. My wife and I both own EVs. It's not a Tesla. It's a Bolt EV, both of them, made by union labor in the United States. Because that's the way we roll. But if this becomes an excuse to not rethink our urban form, to not invest in mass transit, to not try to think about ways of moving people around in different ways, then we're sort of letting ourselves off the hook. Now, one of the things I want to say is that some of what Dr. Catherine and I are both lifting up is a little bit about where California is coming up short. And that's an important message. I always like to make sure that every audience learns a little new Spanish in each session. There's a great expression in Spanish, se cree muy muy, which if you know Spanish, it literally means he believes himself to be very, very. The person is conceited. California se cree muy muy. California is very conceited about what it's doing about climate, what it's doing about equity. We're pointing out where it's coming up short. But it is important to note that this state came up with CalEnviro Screen, which is a way of looking at every census tract in the state and figuring out how overexposed and socially vulnerable it is. Are there some problems with that tool? Yes, but it's first in class in the United States, and it's being picked up on and imitated by the White House with its environmental justice, climate justice screening tool. We have been using the revenues from cap and trade to invest in distressed communities. And about nearly 73% of the dollars that have been spent have gone to communities that are considered disadvantaged. They're in the top 25% of the CalEnviro Screen scores. Are there some problems with some of the spending? Yes, including dairy digesters, which you can talk about. So it is important to understand that we've gotten some stuff right. And the reason why it's important is not just so we can feel good about ourselves, but because what happens in California will not stay in California. The rest of the United States is trying to figure out how to address climate and address equity at the same time. So the reason to look at where we come up short is so we can perfect this model so it can infect the rest of the country in the right way. During the, we often think about California as being this progressive paragon. But remember, we're the state that gave the United States Richard Nixon. Ronald Reagan, Prop 187 and attacks on immigrants, the elimination of bilingual education, the elimination of affirmative action, and we were first to say, wow, we should try to jail black and brown youth at an incredibly insane rate. So we showed the United States how to do it wrong. It's up to us to show the United States now how to do it right. I'm not sure I actually answered your question, but academics generally ignore the questions. So.
No, it's a great job ignoring that question. But no, I'd love to hop into how do we get there, and what can we do going forward, and how do we think about climate policy in California, particularly with this lens that I'm interested in the fact that, well, we have these ambitious mandates and we have these ambitious goals, and we're in danger of not actually reaching them, and that's putting some pressure on a variety of different solutions as we're laying out. I think part of the theme of this talk, perhaps, is that climate solutions are not necessarily pollution solutions, and I think that's what you're getting across to us here. But I mean, just to return to that question of where we're at now, I mean, and you alluded to this very well, Professor Pastor, that what happens in California doesn't stay in California. I mean, what's going on how is the world looking at what we're doing, and how are they mimicking or following in our footsteps, so to speak, with some of these projects and ideas that we've got underway here?
Well, I'll say a couple things, and certainly want to hear what Dr. Catherine has to say, but the, cap and trade has been picked up in other parts of the country, and it's actually at least been picked up with some of the environmental safeguards people are talking about that didn't fully get put in place in California.
And could we briefly define cap and trade too, just for the general audience?
Cap and trade simply is where we put a cap on global carbon emissions from stationary producers. And if one company basically can't make their cap, they pay another company to over-reduce. So they're really trading. The important part to realize about this is that the cap part is equal. Everybody benefits from a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and less global warming. The trade part is inherently unequal, because the only reason you trade is because you don't want to reduce in your place, somebody else is going to reduce, so there's going to be geographic disparities. It doesn't make so much of a difference with the greenhouse gas emissions, but it does with the co-pollutants that are there by their side. So that's being picked up in the rest of the country. I think that some of the guarantees that people are trying to get around green jobs are being picked up in the rest of the country. So I think these policies are important. One thing I think that is very much up on the stage right now, I would say two things, and then Dr. Catherine, is climate resilience. That is, how do we prepare our communities for more heat waves, and what does that mean in terms of urban canopy? What does that mean in terms of more breaks in agriculture for agricultural workers? Because no matter what we do, the planet is going to warm. We are really trying to slow down a disaster, but the disaster is kind of locked in place. So we need to figure out what to do about that. I think the other thing I would say that moves from policy to politics, and it is an important lesson from California. There's a tendency to think we should deal with climate and then we should deal with equity. And the problem with that is that if you deal with the people who are suffering the worst, you're likely to get the best solutions for everyone. But there's another problem with that, which is more political. When you think about who is an environmentalist, I know that what most of us picture is a tall white guy in bicycle shorts, tossing granola over his shoulder as he goes by to another climate march. But for the last almost 20 years, Public Policy Institute of California has polled Californians asking the question, do you think global warming is a very serious issue to the quality of life and our economy in the state of California? And about 50% of white Californians say it's very serious.
Right.
About 60% of black Californians say it's very serious. And about 70% of Asian and Latino Californians say it's very serious. If you want to mobilize a constituency to deal with climate, you got to go to black, brown, and Asian Californians because they're primed to support climate policy. Because it's not so much the white guy in bicycle shorts, who I love and should be mobilized. It's the immigrant Latina mother who has a refinery. It sees next to her, it sees the asthma of her children and associates that with climate. And what I think the rest of the United States is learning, certainly what Biden is learning in the White House, is that the constituency that's ready to be mobilized around environmental conditions is folks of color, low-income communities that are suffering the worst effects. So there's policy lessons, there's political lessons.
And I think that leads us right into sort of the last thing I wanted to kind of touch on and discuss with you too, because we've certainly had a blistering critique of California's climate policy and leadership. But what can we where can we find hope? I mean, and this also has to do with the fact that a lot of these climate conversations circle around the conversation or the topic of doom. We're all doomed, and even here in California, we're doing all these important things and putting these important policies in place. We're doing it wrong. But where do you find hope, and where do you find hope for the future, Dr. Catherine?
Well, first, I just wanted to say thank you, Alejandro and CalMatters, for having me. This has definitely been a really rich conversation, and I'm sure Dr. Pastor and I could talk for many more hours because these are such rich and important topics for the state of California to consider in terms of our climate leadership and equity. Just to quickly close out the last question, in the time that I've seen working on California climate policy, the focus really has been on the technocratic and neoliberal approach where we assume that the market is going to figure it out for us. And so programs like cap and trade and low carbon fuel standard arguably have been pretty successful in terms of revenue generation. We are making money, but that doesn't mean that we're doing this transition equitably, right? And so thinking about a place like Kern County in the San Joaquin Valley that has been reliant on the oil industry for decades, how will we transition in a way that will allow them to continue to fund their public services? So as much as we think about what is being exported from California, I'm also regrounding us in how are we making sure that we're protecting and ensuring the viability of all of our communities in California, regardless of what their historical past was. In terms of where I get hope from, first I just wanted to say for those of you that have experienced or are experiencing what some call climate despair, I see you and I feel you, and I definitely also have those experiences myself. This work is really hard, this issue is incredibly challenging, and it's hard not to feel in crisis mode. Part of what I love and value about working in Coalition is that I get to work with an intergenerational movement of leaders from communities across the valley and across the state who show incredible resistance, resilience, and reworking in the face of all of these challenges. One of my favorite projects right now is a community-based participatory action research project we have in South Stockton, working with local youth to count heavy-duty diesel trucks coming through their communities and talk about what type of enforcement tools and what type of policy solutions solutions are available to reroute those trucks, to electrify those trucks so that they don't have such high asthma rates and such high death from being in the diesel death zone. So really being out there doing the work with my colleagues from all across the movement of all ages is what keeps me going.
And we have, as you can see, just about 1 minute left. What gives you hope, Dr. Pastor?
We wrote a report last year looking at the way in which those dollars were spent from the California Climate Investments Program. And you would have thought the report title would say something about money and budgets and technical stuff. The report title was a call to invest in community power. Because what we found out was that where the money got spent the best and had the biggest impacts, particularly on communities that had suffered the most, was where community organizations were strong, were exercising their voice, and were really able to influence outcomes. If we want to change the way we deliver power in the state, we need to change the system of power in the state. The balance between communities and the government and corporations, the balance between fossil fuels sectors and everybody else, the balance between young people who are hoping for a future and people who are not as worried about what we're leaving for that next generation.
Well, thank you both very much. Everybody, please give us a hand for these two great guests. And thank you again for joining us here. That was our climate discussion. It's been a real pleasure. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.